Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. In this video, we will be talking about the seventh cranial nerve, which is the facial nerve. As part of this lesson, we'll talk about the pathway of the facial nerve. Next, we'll learn about the nuclei, which give off different neurons contributing to the facial nerve. Then we'll talk about the structures innervated by the facial nerve. Then we'll talk about the functions of the cranial nerve nuclei that contribute to the formation of the facial nerve. By doing so, we will understand the function of the nerve as a whole. Lastly, we'll apply this information clinically to understand the clinical deficits associated with the lesion of the facial nerve. So let's start with the facial nerve. As a first step, let's see where does the facial nerve originate from the base of the brain. Now over here you can see an illustration of the base of the brain. You can see the two peduncles of the midbrain. You can see the ventral aspect of the pons over here. The transverse pontocerebellar fibers are clearly visible here. Down below you can see the medulla oblongata. These two longitudinal elevations here are the pyramids, which are clearly visible in the prosection over here as well. See the pyramids over here close to the midline, followed by these lobulated swellings over here, which are known as the olives. The olives can be seen in the illustration over here as well. Now this is the junction of the pons and the medulla, and here you can see three cranial nerves popping out from the junction of the pons and the medulla in a sequence from medial to lateral. These are the abducent nerve and the facial nerve, followed by the vestibulocochlear nerve. The facial nerve can be seen originating as its sensory and motor roots. Here in the prosection as well, you can see the junction of the pons and the medulla, and you can see the facial nerve over here, followed by the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is just lateral to it. Now that we know about the origin of the facial nerve from the base of the brain, let's see how the sensory and motor neurons travel within the facial nerve to innervate various body structures. Now this is an image of the skull where the vault of the skull has been removed and you can see the floor of the cranial cavity clearly. The brainstem resides against this bony region which is known as the clivus, which is comprising of the basilar part of the occipital bone and the posterior aspect of the body of the sphenoid bone. The facial nerve, as we just mentioned, emerges as its sensory and motor roots from the junction of the pons and the medulla in the cerebellopontine angle. The roots later on join together to form the facial nerve. The bony ridge over here is known as the petrous part of the temporal bone, which houses the middle and the inner ear inside it. This foramen on the posterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone is known as the internal acoustic meatus, and the facial nerve, once it has emerged from the brainstem, enters the petrous part of the temporal bone via the internal acoustic meatus. Several other structures which accompany the facial nerve include the vestibulocochlear nerve and the labyrinthine artery, which also enter into the petrous part of the temporal bone via the internal acoustic meatus. Now let's cut open the petrous part of the temporal bone to visualize the pathway of the facial nerve through the bone. See here the petrous part of the temporal bone has been cut open and we can see the middle ear cavity inside over here. This is the lateral aspect of the middle ear cavity where we can see the inner surface of the tympanic membrane. The eustachian or the nasopharyngeal tube can be seen anteriorly connecting the middle ear cavity with the nasopharynx. This is the medial aspect of the middle ear cavity where we can see the bony promontory. You can also see the impressions of the semicircular canals over here. The facial nerve can be seen entering the petrous part of the temporal bone via the internal acoustic meatus. Since we have cut open the petrous part of the temporal bone, we can visualize the facial nerve passing through the bony facial canal. This canal over here is known as the facial canal, starting from the internal acoustic meatus, passing through the petrous bone, and then exiting over here at this point. Along its course within the facial canal, the facial nerve gives off three main branches. These include the greater petrosal nerve, which can be seen over here. This nerve contains the secretomotor fibers to the lacrimal gland. A nerve to the stapedius is given off, which contains the special visceral efferent motor fibers, which innervate a muscle inside the middle ear cavity, which is called the stapedius. And then finally, the third branch, which is given off inside the facial canal by the facial nerve, is the chorda tympani. The chorda tympani can be seen passing through the middle ear cavity and then exiting from the other side over here. It actually serves as a connection between the facial nerve and the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, and it serves as a conduit for the passage of the secretomotor fibers from the facial nerve into the trigeminal nerve to eventually reach the submandibular and sublingual salivary gland. Also, the taste fibers coming from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, which are sensory fibers, they also pass through the chorda tympani to eventually enter into the facial nerve inside the facial canal. The facial nerve then exits the facial canal via the stylomastoid foramen. After exiting through the stylomastoid foramen, the facial nerve innervates different muscles, including the occipital belly of occipitofrontalis muscle and the posterior auricular muscle right behind the ear. It also innervates some muscles, including the posterior belly of the digastric and the stylohyoid muscles, following which the facial nerve then enters into the parotid gland, where it divides into its 5 terminal branches for the muscles of facial expression. These include the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, the marginal mandibular, and cervical branches of the facial nerve. All of these innervate the muscles of facial expression. Now that we know a little bit about the course of the facial nerve, how about if we take up the nuclei of the facial nerve one by one? We said that we will commence studying each cranial nerve using this table and this pictorial representation of the table over here. So if we look at the facial nerve in this table over here, the table suggests that the facial nerve is a mixed nerve. That is, it has both sensory as well as motor components to it. It has 2 motor nuclei and 1 sensory nucleus. One of the motor nucleus is situated in the special visceral efferent column of the table and hence will innervate all the structures which are derived from the second branchial arch. The other nucleus is situated inside the general visceral efferent column of the table, which is a column for the autonomic motor nuclei. And this nucleus will innervate autonomic or the visceral structures which are not under our voluntary control. And these will include mainly the lacrimal gland and the 2 salivary glands, including the submandibular and the sublingual salivary glands. The sensory nucleus is situated inside the special visceral afferent column of the table and is known as the nucleus of tractus solitarius. The nucleus of tractus solitarius receives the sensory information of taste via neurons running in 3 different nerves. These include the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. And that is the reason why the nucleus of tractus solitarius has been positioned in the table in front of all these 3 nerves, as it serves as a common special visceral afferent nucleus for all these 3 nerves, including the facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. Now first we will talk about the facial motor nucleus, which is a special visceral efferent or a branchiomotor nucleus. This is the left lateral view of the head and neck region. You can see a little schematic over here, which is a schematic of the brainstem. You can see the pons drawn over here, followed by the medulla oblongata, and you can see the cerebellum at the back over here. Together, they are sandwiching this fourth ventricle right in the middle. The facial motor nucleus is a special visceral efferent branchiomotor nucleus, which is color coded in red over here. It receives the upper motor neurons from the cerebral cortex. Those would be the corticonuclear fibers. The nucleus itself contains the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons. The efferent lower motor neurons, once they pop out from the nucleus, they first move backwards and wind around the nucleus of the abducent nerve, which is posteriorly situated within the brainstem. These winding fibers of the facial nerve, along with the underlying 6th nerve nucleus, create an elevation in the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is called the facial colliculus. The efferent neurons, after taking a turn around the abducent nucleus, they move forward to exit the brainstem as they travel through the motor branch of the facial nerve. These special visceral efferent neurons then travel through the facial nerve while inside the facial canal and give rise to a branch for the stapedius muscle. The stapedius muscle is a small muscle within the middle ear cavity, which is attached to the stapes, which is one of the ossicles in the middle ear cavity, the muscle, when it contracts, it prevents the ossicle to vibrate with a very large amplitude. And therefore, when there is a lesion of the facial nerve, that leads to paralysis of the stapedius muscle, which leads to the stapes oscillating with an extra large amplitude, resulting in the patient hearing louder than usual, a condition which is known as the hyperacusis. The fibers then exit the facial canal and travel through the distal branches of the facial nerve to innervate the muscles such as the muscles of facial expression, the posterior belly of occipitofrontalis, stylohyoid, posterior belly of digastric, and the posterior auricular muscles. Now, this is a very important illustration to understand the facial nerve palsy. This is a schematic of the pons over here and the medulla oblongata down below, and you can see the facial motor nucleus situated inside the pons. The nucleus can be divided into an upper half and a lower half. The upper half has been color coded in red, while the lower half has been color coded in blue or purple. The lower motor neurons, which pop out from the upper half of the nucleus, they innervate the muscles of facial expression in the upper half of the face, while the lower motor neurons, which pop out from the lower half of the nucleus, they innervate the muscles of facial expression in the lower half of the face. Now you can see that this facial motor nucleus receives the upper motor neuron fibers from the cerebral cortex, which are called as the corticonuclear or the corticobulbar fibers. However, the important thing which you have to know over here is that the upper half receives corticonuclear fibers from both the right as well as from the left side, whereas the lower half receives the upper motor neuron corticonuclear fibers only from the contralateral or the opposite side. Therefore, if there is a lesion of the facial nerve, such as a Bell's palsy or a mechanical trauma of the nerve during a parotid surgery, then all the lower motor neurons they get damaged and there will be a hemiparalysis involving the muscles of the entire half of the face of the same site. For instance, in the figure, what you can see over here is that there is a lower motor neuron lesion on the right side over here, resulting in the hemiparalysis of the face on the right side. This actually causes the healthy muscles on the left side to pull the face towards the right side, resulting in the deviation of the face away from the side of the lesion. So the deviated side is the healthy side, the paralysis is on the left side, and the healthy side gets deviated towards the right, which is opposite to the side of the lesion. However, in case of an upper motor neuron lesion, such as in a cortical stroke, the upper part of the facial motor nucleus will still be able to function as it is receiving the upper motor neuron fibers from both sides, and thus its innervation gets compensated from the ipsilateral side. But the lower half of the facial motor nucleus, which receives its upper motor neuron corticonuclear fibers only from the contralateral side, it therefore gets impaired, resulting in the paralysis of muscles of the lower quadrant of the face opposite to the side of the lesion. For instance, in the figure, you can see that there is a lesion in the right cerebral cortex, resulting in the loss of function of the lower part of the facial motor nucleus on the left side, which then leads to paralysis of the facial muscles of the lower quadrant of the face on the left side. So therefore, in this case, the healthy side would then deviate towards the right side, which means the deviation of the face would be towards the side of the lesion. To summarize, when you see a patient who has paralysis of the entire half of the face, then that suggests that there's a lower motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve or the nucleus on the same side as that of the paralysis. While if you see a paralysis of the lower quadrant of the face, then that suggests that there's an upper motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve above the level of the pons, away from the side of the paralysis. Now let's talk about the superior salivatory nucleus. Once again, this is the left lateral view of the head and neck region. The schematic of the brainstem with the pons and the medulla oblongata is shown over here. The superior salivatory nucleus is a general visceral efferent nucleus, which is a parasympathetic nucleus, and it is shown in the pons over here, color coded in yellow. Since this is an autonomic nucleus, therefore the neurons which pop out from the superior salivatory nucleus will be the preganglionic parasympathetic neurons. These will innervate the lacrimal gland and the submandibular and the sublingual salivary glands. So these neurons will pass through the sensory root of the facial nerve. The sensory root is also known as the nervus intermedius, this one which is present at the top over here. The preganglionic neurons, after passing through the sensory root, they would pass through the geniculate ganglion. However, they won't synapse over here. They're going to pass through this first branch of the facial nerve, which we talked about, which is given off while the facial nerve is running inside the facial canal. This first branch is known as the greater petrosal nerve. Now, the parasympathetic neurons running inside the greater petrosal nerve, they will combine on their way with the sympathetic neurons, which are coming from another nerve called the deep petrosal nerve. The deep petrosal nerve actually pops off from the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery. So the sympathetic fibers from the deep petrosal nerve and the parasympathetic fibers from the greater petrosal nerve, they combine together to form what is known as the nerve of the pterygoid canal, somewhere in this region over here. The nerve of pterygoid canal then carries these preganglionic parasympathetic neurons and the sympathetic neurons as well, of course. These parasympathetic neurons, they reach inside a ganglion here inside the pterygopalatine fossa. This ganglion is known as the pterygopalatine or sphenopalatine ganglion. Now, this is the ganglion which contains the postganglionic parasympathetic neuronal cell bodies, and that's where these preganglionic parasympathetic neurons coming from the superior salivatory nucleus, they will synapse with the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. The postganglionic parasympathetic neurons then will jump off from the pterygopalatine ganglion to the V2 division or maxillary division of the trigeminal, which is not shown over here. So basically, the facial nerve does not have access to the front part of the face, and therefore it has to take help from the trigeminal nerve and its divisions to eventually reach the front part of the face. And so the postganglionic neurons, they jump over to the maxillary division of trigeminal, from where they jump over to the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve and eventually pass through the lacrimal branch of ophthalmic nerve to reach the lacrimal gland, providing parasympathetic innervation to the gland. Now, this is a magnified view of the innervation of the lacrimal gland, which we just talked about. Here, you can see the geniculate ganglion and the facial nerve passing through the facial canal. You can see a branch called the greater petrosal nerve popping off from the geniculate ganglion from the facial nerve, and the parasympathetic neurons, the preganglionic parasympathetic neurons, which we talked about, coming off from superior salivatory nucleus, they'll be passing through the greater petrosal nerve. Now, you can see the internal carotid artery with the plexus of sympathetic neurons around it. These plexuses of sympathetic neurons, they will give off the deep petrosal nerve, which will contain these sympathetic neurons. And you can see here the deep petrosal nerve combining with the greater petrosal nerve coming from the back, and they join together to form the nerve of pterygoid canal, which is now entering into this region called the pterygopalatine fossa, where the pterygopalatine ganglion is situated. This is where the synapse happens with the cell bodies of postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, and then you can see this trigeminal ganglion giving off V1 and V2 divisions over here and the V3 branch over here. You can see that the postganglionic neurons from the ganglion, from the pterygopalatine ganglion, will jump over to the maxillary branch of the trigeminal, from where they will reach over to the V1 or the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve, and eventually through the lacrimal branch of the ophthalmic division of trigeminal, these neurons would be able to eventually reach the lacrimal gland and innervating the gland, producing lacrimation or the tears. Now, those preganglionic parasympathetic neurons coming from the superior salivatory nucleus, which are meant to go to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands, these neurons will pass through the nervus intermedius or the sensory branch of facial nerve, but from here onwards, they're going to pass down through the facial nerve running inside the facial canal. Now, these preganglionic neurons then will actually pop out through the second branch of the facial nerve in the facial canal, and this second branch was the chorda tympani nerve. The chorda tympani is basically a neuronal channel which connects the facial nerve once again with the trigeminal nerve, because we mentioned that the facial nerve doesn't have access to the front part of the face, so it has to actually pass through the trigeminal to reach the anteriorly situated structures such as the glands. And now in this case, the preganglionic neurons, they pass through the chorda tympani to reach the V3 division or the mandibular division of trigeminal. Now, one of the branches of the V3 or mandibular division of trigeminal nerve is the lingual nerve. So the chorda tympani basically connects the facial nerve with the lingual branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. The, these preganglionic neurons traveling through the lingual nerve eventually come out of the nerve to reach and synapse over here inside the ganglion called the submandibular ganglion, where the synapse with the cell bodies of the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. These postganglionic neurons will then innervate the submandibular gland, or they could actually go back into the lingual nerve to travel a little bit more forward to eventually reach and innervate the sublingual salivary gland, and thus resulting in the production of the saliva. This is just another recap where you can actually see the facial nerve, the geniculate ganglion, and the facial nerve passing through the facial canal. You can see the first branch of the facial nerve inside the facial canal, which is the greater petrosal nerve, and you can see the greater petrosal nerve reaching over to the pterygopalatine ganglion as the nerve of pterygoid canal. And you can see the chorda tympani nerve over here nicely, which is the second branch of facial nerve inside the facial canal. And you can see that it is connecting the facial nerve with the lingual branch of the V3 or the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Now let's talk about the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Once again, this is a left lateral view of the head and neck region. The schematic of the brainstem with the pons and the medulla oblongata is shown over here. The nucleus of tractus solitarius is a visceral efferent nucleus, which is shown color-coded in green over here. It can be divided into a lower or a caudal part and an upper rostral part. The upper rostral part receives sensory information of taste from neurons running through three different cranial nerves, including the facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. We are interested in knowing the details of the taste neurons which travel through the facial nerve. These special visceral afferent taste neurons, they pass through the nervus intermedius or the sensory branch of the facial nerve to eventually enter into the brainstem to reach the rostral part of the nucleus of tractus solitarius here in the brainstem. Now let's try to learn this taste pathway in a little bit more detail. So what you can see over here is the superior view of the tongue, and you can see the tongue from the lateral side over here. You can see that there's a sulcus present on the tongue, which is a V-shaped sulcus. This is known as the sulcus terminalis, which basically splits up the tongue into an anterior two-third, which is a more horizontal part of the tongue, and a posterior one-third part over here, which is more vertically oriented, can be seen much more clearly on the left lateral view over here. The sensory information of taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is carried by neurons which are running inside the facial nerve, whereas the sensory information of taste from the posterior one-third of the tongue behind the sulcus terminalis, that is carried by the neurons running inside the glossopharyngeal nerve. And lastly, the sensory information of taste from the most posterior part of the tongue over here, which is the area where the oropharynx is situated. The taste information from this oropharyngeal mucosal area is actually carried by neurons running inside the vagus nerve. We are interested in knowing in detail about the pathway taken up by the taste neurons which run inside the facial nerve, bringing sensory information from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. Now we've come across this schematic before as well. You are looking at the left lateral view of the face. See the trigeminal ganglion with its three divisions, the V1 ophthalmic division, the V2 which is maxillary division, and the V3 which is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. The V3 or the mandibular division then gives off further sub-branches, including the lingual nerve in the front over here and the inferior alveolar nerve which goes to the teeth. The special visceral afferent sensory neurons from the anterior two-third of the tongue, they carry the taste information as they travel via the lingual nerve. These then pass via the chorda tympani, which is actually connecting the lingual nerve, which is a branch of the V3, with the facial nerve shown over here running inside the facial canal. These sensory neurons, these special visceral afferent taste neurons, coming from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, they pass through the chorda tympani to eventually enter into the facial nerve and then ascend up in the facial nerve inside the facial canal. They pass through the geniculate ganglion. These neurons, they have their cell bodies residing inside over here, inside the geniculate ganglion. Remember, as we're talking about the sensory taste pathway, so we can break it up into a first order, second order, and a third order neuron, just like most other sensory pathways. These neurons, which we have talked about so far, traveling through the lingual nerve, through the chorda tympani, and then ascending up in the facial nerve, these are the first order neurons. These are the dendrites of the first order neurons, and the cell bodies are situated inside the geniculate ganglion. And remember, the first order neuronal cell bodies are always inside the peripheral nervous system, so that is why we can see the geniculate ganglion over here containing cell bodies of these first order neurons inside the facial nerve, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the axons of these first order neuronal cell bodies from the geniculate ganglion would then pass through the sensory branch or the nervous intermediates of the facial nerve to enter inside the brainstem. Inside the brainstem, these neurons would then synapse with the cell bodies of the second order neurons, which are inside the nucleus of tractus solitarius. To be more specific, in the rostral or the upper part of the nucleus of tractus solitarius. The second order neuronal cell bodies from the tractus solitarius would then project to the third order neuronal cell bodies, which are inside the thalamus. The thalamus is the relay station for every sensory information, and so the taste is no exception either. From the thalamus, these sensory neurons would then project the taste information to the relevant area inside the cerebral cortex, where the sensory perception of the taste is going to happen. Right, so as part of this video, we talked about the origin of the facial nerve from the brainstem. We talked about the pathway which is taken by the facial nerve, and we enumerated the different branches of the facial nerve. Then we enumerated the different nuclei of the facial nerve and their functions. We talked about the pathway of the sensory and the motor neurons running inside the facial nerve, going to the sensory nuclei of the facial nerve, or popping out from the motor nuclei of the facial nerve. Lastly, we also try to understand the potential clinical deficits which could result as a result of the lesions of the facial nerve. So I hope you benefited from this video. If yes, then please do like the video and don't forget to subscribe the channel. Until next time, goodbye.